It's a special day. It's a special week because we've got a new album by Iron Maiden. Out of nowhere it's appeared, and here it is, Senjutsu. But is it any good? Could it be one of the best Iron Maiden albums that we've heard for a long time? Well, keep on watching and I'll tell you what it's all about. Welcome back to Rocker's Beer Review. This is my review of the Iron Maiden Senjutsu album. Now this album was announced just 6 weeks ago, pretty much out of nowhere, and without much fanfare, just suddenly appeared with one song out of that. Now Iron Maiden, as everyone will know, are a heavy metal band, and this album is no different than normal Iron Maiden. There's not going to be much that's different here, and like a lot of the sort of their recent albums of the last sort of decade or 2 decades even, they're moving more and more towards a more sort of progressive metal. This album is a long one. It's a double album, 81 minutes long. There's 10 tracks though. 3 of the tracks are over 10 minutes long, and the shortest track is just over 4 minutes. Now, if you like Iron Maiden, then there's a lot to like here. You know, they don't reinvent the wheel really. It's full on typical heavy metal from Iron Maiden. Yes, I mean, as I said, some of the songs are a bit longer, it's less immediate, but there are some shorter songs on here, which I'm sure that, you know, people that don't like the big long epic sort of songs will also get a lot of enjoyment from. There's top-notch playing. Obviously all 3 guitarists are on top of their game. Bruce Dickinson himself is in fine form. I think this will probably be the first album after he overcome the throat cancer. So this album was written and recorded actually in 2019. So it's been sort of delayed in terms of its release for 2 years, probably due to the pandemic. And obviously Iron Maiden will be headlining one of the days at Download next year in 2022. That's obviously been delayed. So let's go through each of the tracks, track by track, and I'll let you know a little bit about them and what I think of the track. So the opening track is the title track, Senjutsu. This clocks in at 8 minutes and 20 seconds, so it starts with quite a long sort of song. It's written by Steve Harris and Adrian Smith, and in my opinion it's quite a weak opening track. It's a little bit slow to get going, then it sort of turns into a sort of mid-pace rocker with an almost sort of tribal drum sound, but over the course of its 8 minutes, it doesn't really sort of develop. There's no sort of build up or anything really. It just sort of saunters along really, and I think a little bit of editing would have made it a better track. So for me, probably the weakest track of the album and not really a good start. The second track, however, though, is called Stratego. This is their sort of second release song. I wouldn't like to say it's a single, but it was released before the album, the second one that was released. This is a shorter track, it's just under 5 minutes long, and this was written by Yannick Gers, the guitarist, and Steve Harris, bass player. When I first heard this, you know, before the album came out, it didn't really resonate with me much. But now I've heard it quite a few times. I think it's got much more sort of appeal to it. And it's a little bit more instant than a lot of the other tracks on the album. It starts off, Steve Harris's real sort of clanky sort of bass sound goes throughout. And Bruce has got some really solid singing on this. And his voice sort of builds up into the chorus, into a sort of crescendo, into a much higher sort of register really. And I think the thing is with this track, which is different than a lot of the other tracks, it never really outstays its welcome. It's just about the right length, and I think it's going to be a real live favourite. So that's a good track, track number 2. Track number 3, I'm sure most of you would have heard already. This is The Writing on the Wall. This is the first song that was released when they announced the album. And it was written by Bruce Dickinson and Adrian Smith and clocks in at 6 minutes and 13 seconds. This is a really great song. It's another sort of mid-pace rocker with a sort of slightly acoustic sort of start to it. It sounds got a little bit of a folky sort of sound as well, but it's got a great bluesy Adrian Smith solo, which is a little bit longer than a lot of his typical sort of solos. I've seen a recent interview that he, you know, usually do sort of 8 bars in terms of the solos, but this one's a lot more extended, and I think it's a really cracking solo. As I say, you're seeing Maiden moves just a slight inch away from their sort of normal heavy metal template, but not too much really. It's somewhere where they could go, but then they draw it back in to sound very much like a classic Maiden song. Track 4 though, I think is slightly different, and in my opinion is my favourite song on the album, certainly at the moment. So this is called Lost in a Lost World. It was written by Steve Harris on his own, and it's a long song. It's 9.5 minutes, and it's probably the first of the true sort of epics on the album. And for me, the beginning starts quite strange. Bruce Dickinson's singing with a sort of slightly different register. He's got a slightly different tone to his voice. I don't know whether there's effects on there, but his voice sounds slightly different. And there's a lot more sort of backing vocals. You don't hear huge amounts of backing vocals with Maiden, but it's almost like a sort of choir sound in the backing. And as I say, it sounds quite different than anything Maiden's really done before. It sort of makes you think more of sort of bands like Jethro Tull, really. It's got a folky sort of acoustic sound, lots of sort of acoustic and gentle playing guitars. This is until after 2 minutes, and then when the rest of the band come in, the bass comes in, the drums come in, it sounds more like the Maiden we all know and love. As I said, at the moment, it's probably one of my favourite tracks. It just sounds pretty good. In fact, for me, when I first heard it, it sort of reminds me a little bit of Revelations, which is one of the tracks from Peace of Mind that came out, 30, 40 years ago. It reminds me a little bit of that, although it's still different at the same time. So a really good track 4, Lost in a Lost World. Track number 5, we've got another short track. It's actually the shortest track on the album. It's called Days of Future Past. It is another song written by Adrian Smith and Bruce Dickinson. And again, I like it because it's short, it's immediate. It doesn't sort of go off and sort of take time to get going. It comes right in with a real strong riff before sort of Bruce Dickinson sort of air raid siren sort of voice belts out the song. For me, it's another highlight. I mean, usually I would prefer longer, more epic sort of songs, but it's the short songs that just resonate. They're just a bit more immediate. It's instantly catchy, this song. And again, there's some really great solos, and there's some great solos all through this album. Track 5, then we've got the Time Machine. This slows it down again. We've got a slow melodic intro. The song's 7 minutes and 9 seconds, so it's a sort of, it's not overly long, but it's not, you wouldn't call it a short song by any stretch of the imagination. This is the second song on the album, written by Yannick Gers and Steve Harris. And after the sort of short intro, it's another sort of mid-pace sort of rocker and a very sort of typical Maiden song. There's loads of sort of twin and triple lead guitar parts, and it sort of culminates in a, quite a frenzied solo, which I probably think is a Yannick Gers. It's very sort of typical of his sort of solos. And then you get a bit more of a bluesy sort of, which I think is probably Dave Murray's sort of typical sort of solo. And the song sort of ends like it starts, really, with a slow sort of melodic outro, and that's quite similar to a lot of the epics on this song. They start slow on this album, they start off slow for a minute or two, then they pick up, then they get really heavy, the solos, and then it sort of slows down again in the last sort of minute. Track 7, though, is probably the closest to a true ballad on the album. This is called TheDarkest Hour. Again, this is a Smith and Dickinson written song, the third on the album. For me, it's another great classic song. 7 minutes, 20 seconds. It's there, as the songwriters, it's their longest song. And as I said, I think it's pretty much closer to a true ballad. It's slow all the way through. It's based on Winston Churchill's early time at the beginning of the Second World War. And again, Adrian Smith plays an extended, quite an atmospheric sort of guitar solo, which to my opinion is up there with some of the best. Reminds me a little bit of the solos in things like A Stranger in a Strange Land. Not typical Maiden, really. It's another great song. Now we go on to track 8, and this is the first of the first of 3 songs, the last 3 songs on the album, that are all over 10 minutes long, and all of them written by Steve Harris. The first of these, the epic, is called The Death of the Celts, and this is, although it's the shortest of the 3, it's still 10 minutes and 20 seconds, but it's another song. Reminds me of, obviously, the subject matter, obviously, as well, but it reminds me a little bit of The Klansman and songs like that. It's obviously about Scottish history. It's a very typical Maiden epic. We start with a soft acoustic guitar, then we've got some light sort of finger picking electric guitar at the beginning as well, before it sort of heads off into a sort of mid-pace rocker, with multiple solos throughout and extended instrumental sort of parts really, and then it sort of near the end it sort of speeds up. Well, actually probably about halfway through it speeds up a little bit more before again, like a lot of the epics on here, slows back down in the last minute. It's a good track, and I'm sure that with more listens I'm sort of going to enjoy it more and more. It's a little bit more immediate, for a long song. It's got a few good hooks in it. Track 9, now this is called the Parchment, and it's the sort of penultimate track and also the longest at 12 minutes and 38 seconds. Similar to the sort of previous track, it starts off slow, but it has a much more sort of has a Middle Eastern sort of theme to it. It has that sort of slightly Egyptian sort of theme as well. There's a lot more extended instrumental parts on it and solos, and in my opinion it's probably one of the heaviest of the epic sort of tracks. I think a lot of people will find this one difficult to get into. It's a little bit long, it doesn't have the sort of hooks, and again, it's there's a lot of instrumentation on this really, but it's the last sort of 2 minutes just really sort of gets really going and really becomes a real bombastic sort of song with lots of frenzies of different solos in there. I think it's a sort of slow burn track really. It's probably the last song that people will really get into. Then we got the last song on the album, Hell on Earth, and this is obviously the last of the Harris epics. But it's only 11 minutes and 19 seconds, so it's the medium length out of those three. But in my opinion, it's probably the best of the three. Although it's structurally different with sort of a slow melodic sort of 2-minute odd intro till the drums come in, and then you've got the usual sort of romping Maiden sound. But it's almost it's quite uplifting, in terms of the way that the riff is, the way the sound of the music, and euphoric really. You can imagine, the sort of crowd cheering along as this song comes out, so I'd be interested to see what it's live. Even when Bruce starts singing, and that's not until the 3.5 minute mark, it's very uplifted. It's almost like a big anthem really. So it's got a lot more hooks in than you would expect for a song that's like over 10 minutes long. Solos come in around 6 minutes. All three guitarists play a solo before again the song slows down to a sort of, you've almost got some keyboards in there. You've got sort of an atmospheric sort of keyboard sound, with sort of strings and orchestra, sort of orchestra sort of sound, with just like Steve Harris's bass. And then it slows right down with that, and then it picks up again into a sort of monstrous crescendo before again breaking down like all the epics into a soft sort of melodic final minute. Although it's a long song, to me it sounds a lot shorter because there's a lot more hooks in it, and I think any song that's 11 minutes plus long but seems to be over really quickly makes it a really classic song, and I think it's going to go down as one of the best epics on the album, and certainly in my opinion one of the best songs on the album as well. So that's the album, Iron Maiden Senjutsu. But what do you think? Is it a good album? Is it up there with some of the best? And if you've heard it already, what's your favourite song? Do you agree with us about my favourites? As I say, Lost in a Lost World, TheDarkest Hour, and the last song, Hell on Earth, to me are my favourite songs, but I also quite like all of the shorter ones as well. They're all great. But let me know in the comments, what do you think? Is this a classic Iron Maiden album? Could this be the best Iron Maiden album ever? Let me know, and until the next one, keep on rocking.